Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge. I remember a while back there was this conversational dynamic that I saw happening a lot. And not just, well, I guess Reddit's a social media. So like different like social media conversations and like Reddit conversations where a person would complain about something in their life, some challenge or problem they were having. And another person would say something to the effect of, well, count your blessings. At least it's not as bad as people, and then they would name something that they would think is worse. And then another person would come in and defend the original poster by saying something to the effect of, well, just because people have problems, like different problems in different parts of the world, doesn't mean that the problem that the person is experiencing or complaining about isn't valid. And I remember reading, every time I read that kind of conversation, I would think both people are right. How are both people right? How is it that I agree with the person who said, count your blessings, at least it's not as bad as XYZ? And how is it that I would agree with the person who said, yeah, and also that doesn't mean that it invalidates the experience of the person's challenge that they're complaining about? And ultimately, I came to, well, it is because both of them are accurate and right. So what is the better perspective to take? So in this podcast, we want to revisit a model that we've talked about many times in the past. We recorded an entire podcast on it. We referenced it a lot in the early days of the podcast. If you've gotten any of our programs, then I talk about it in a lot of our programs. I've written articles on it. And that's because the model we want to talk about today is one of my favorites, and that is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's a model that, despite its simplicity, I find is incredibly helpful for diagnosing a lot of different challenges people are going through, helping people figure out what needs are going unmet and are causing pain points, and then to also study a basic element of our psychology as it relates to our relationship to the challenges and problems that we go through in life, and are dismissing or not dismissing other people's challenges.
Categorically, this is a vertical model. So we've talked about in the past the difference between a horizontal model, which is differentiating. It helps you determine if everybody's on the same playing field, differences between people or between things, making distinctions. That's a horizontal model, like the Myers-Briggs system, for example. And then there's vertical models, which are layered, where you go through levels of ascension in this model. So one level is beyond the level before it. So it's a vertical model going upward. And there are degrees of, I don't know if you call it complexity, or degrees of sophistication or challenges at these different levels that other levels don't deal with.
So we recommend, if you're unfamiliar with this model, to go check out the original podcast we did on it. We lay it out pretty clearly. We spent an entire podcast just talking about the different levels of Maslow. We'll revisit it very quickly right now, but we more want to talk about effectively some of the strategies or some of the different styles of pain that people experience as they're going through these levels, and some of the strategies that we unconsciously employ that might not actually be helping us solve our problems. So very quickly, Maslow's hierarchy of needs is generally drawn out as a pyramid, with the lowest level being survival. So these are a hierarchy of human needs that we require to get met in order to feel a sense of zen, or like everything's copacetic. And at the bottom, the very first need we have is survival. So that makes sense, right? We need to survive, right? We need food, shelter. We need ways of, continuing the species. So sex usually comes into that as well. And these are just like the basic biological needs that people have. Once those needs are met, we automatically kick into a place called safety and security, which is not just survival, but then making that survival sustainable, that we create an environment or a context where our survival is generally handled, but now it's just a matter of making sure that we have a sense of security around our survival. So in the modern world, that's usually things like paying our bills and making sure that everybody is okay, and like getting anxious when somebody that you love is out too late and hasn't called, right? Those are like safety and security issues. Then once that is handled and we feel those needs are generally met, usually financially, then we kick up to the next level, which is love and belongingness. And these are our relationships. These are the needs we have to not just have communication with other human beings, but actually intimacy and a sense of belongingness in a community. So it's connectedness and intimacy. When we feel those needs are met, we kick up to the next level, which is self-esteem. This is us figuring out, like what we're capable of as people, how competent we are, what we can achieve as individuals and in a collective. And then once those needs are met, or at least we feel they are, then we kick up into self-actualization. And self-actualization is transformation. It's us going to the next level of our life. It's reevaluating who we are and becoming something more than what we were before. Like, think of this as metamorphosis.
I see it as radical sovereignty, meaning that up until this point in Maslow, there's this sense of an outside force or objective, something out there that creates who I am or manifests my life. And when you get to self-actualization, you realize, I think at this level, that you are 100% sovereign over your experience and the essence of who you are. You generate that from within. And it's a little esoteric because I think it's a place that's post-lingual. It's post-able to articulate. It's more experiential than anything when you get here. And we also talk about Maslow. These aren't things necessarily you stay at. These are levels that you can flow in and out of over time, depending on your circumstance or where you are in your life or what's happening around you. As an example, if you're in a dark alley, someone brings a knife out to try to kill you or mug you, you're going to drop down into survival no matter how self-actualized you are.
Yeah, and I think I've watched people in my life go through up and down these levels in choices that they've made as well. Like, my dad, when I was very young, my dad was quite financially successful. And then when he went to self-actualization, he decided to give everything up to be a missionary. So by the time I was in 8 or 9, my life changed very, very dramatically. And we went from living in a very nice house on a golf course to basically me growing up as a teenager in trailer parks and being very poor. And he chose through his self-actualization to make different spiritual choices, which actually then put us into safety and security, safety and security. Because at that point, he and my entire family struggled to make ends meet. So it's not like the choices we make at the top are going to keep, quote unquote, at the top, are going to keep us there. Sometimes those choices actually end up putting us in dangerous situations, which is fine because it was actually what he wanted to do and it was very self-actualized of him. It made him happy.
Yeah, and I would also argue that just because you're self-actualized doesn't mean you're a good person or there's goodness there. Probably a lot of serial killers are, I don't know, maybe they don't have some love and belongingness needs met, but I would say that there are some people that they're so sovereign and self-actualized to a degree, but they're not necessarily outputting in the best way. Like they're not contributing in a good way. They're just completely self-actualized for themselves.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you're going to pit it next to a very complementary model, which is the Graves model or spiral dynamics, it's kind of like saying that not everybody who's at Graves 6 or 7 or spiral green or yellow is a good human being. Like, there's going to be people there who are, sociopaths. Like, that's just how it works. So it's not like going up the levels necessarily means you're better or worse. It's just where you're at in that moment of time. And it helps diagnose what needs you may have going unmet and might be creating sticking points for you.
Yeah, this isn't a model, I think, of morality or anything beyond a descriptive where you're at and the needs you have. I agree with you.
Right. And I think that that's probably one of the reasons why it's so helpful is that it isn't a model of morality and it's not a model of superiority. It's a diagnostic tool to determine what's going on for you and the challenges you face. And I think going back to the original conversations on social media that I was seeing, the reason why I agree with both the position that one should count their blessings and also that it doesn't invalidate the pain that a person is experiencing, even if other people, quote unquote, have it worse, is that we're defining having it worse as being lower on Maslow's pyramid. It's a thankfulness that one isn't dealing with something like survival. And the reason why it's a blessing to be higher up in this hierarchy of needs is that the lower you are, right, the closer you are to Maslow's basement, as we have a tendency to call it, is that you don't have as much buffer Like if you fail your survival needs, that means you died, right? Or are going, like you're in a bad place. You're in a seriously bad place where your very life is being threatened. If you are in safety and security and you're not making it, it means that you may be kicked out of your house or apartment. It means that your shelter is being threatened. So the further down you are, the less of a buffer you have for recovery. And so there's a blessing to going up these levels. The higher up you are, the more buffer you have to deal with the pain that you're experiencing. But each level has its own nightmare, right? Each level has a very powerful, strong sense of pain when those needs are not getting met.
It becomes much more binary at the lowest level because it is literally about survival. You're either alive or you're dead. And every level up is 1 degree removed from that binary aspect of life or death. When you're in a relationship with somebody, it doesn't work out. You don't necessarily die. Even your safety and security may not even be threatened. You just may have to find a different relationship, for example. You might be lonely at that level, for love and belongingness for a time, but it doesn't mean your survival. You might feel like your survival is threatened, but it doesn't mean your survival is necessarily threatened in that moment.
Yeah, and if you feel, say, suicidal because of the problems you're feeling at the higher levels, well, then you've kicked yourself down to survival because now you're thinking about literally ending your life. And so the further down you go, the less buffer you have. And so there is something to be said for counting your blessings. It's basically like counting your buffers, right? Like feel good that you have more buffer than other people. And that said, like I mentioned, each level has its own nightmare scenario. So I think we should probably walk through some of the pain that is experienced at each level and some of the strategies or techniques we use in order to anesthetize ourselves against some of those greater pain points. So as mentioned with survival, the pain is physical. It's very somatic. A lot of people who maybe are even in a good financial situation and aren't that worried about safety and security, if they're dealing with extremely poor health that's threatening their life, they're actually in survival because their body is at a point where it itself is betraying them. And so the pain point of survival is usually physical pain. And that even includes things like, it could be hunger pains. It could be the pain of exposure to the elements. It could be the pain that is experienced when one is not able to get their sexual needs met because there's a lot of physical pain that comes along with that as well. So the pain at survival is some of the easiest to observe and diagnose. It's very obvious because it literally hurts your body.
The blessing at this level is that pain is very obvious, like you said. And so there's not a lot of abstraction here. There's I'm hungry, my stomach hurts, I need to feed myself to feel better here. There's a very direct, again, it's very binary. It's a very direct relationship with what's going to get that need met. One rung up into safety and security, we start getting into the abstract world because it's basically a level of survival, but it's on a longer timeline. So it's about not just eating today, but it's paying the rent for the entire month. So I can live in this dwelling for this entire month. And then 1 month from now, I've got to do that again. So the timeline gets stretched, the abstraction gets higher, and the pain points turn into more abstraction as well. They turn more emotional than physical. So at this level, anxiety becomes something that we have to deal with as the pain point. Worry, stress, future pacing of disasters that could be coming to remove our safety and security and knock us back into survival are on the forefront of our minds all the time. So it creates this sense of abstraction and just a low-grade anxiety, I think, at this level is what we deal with the most as humans.
Yeah, or fear, like the fear of loved ones getting hurt, or like fear, anxiety, like all the things that give you a stomach ache, right? Like these are the pain points of this level.
And so you still have that stomach ache, maybe, the physicality of it, because your body's trying to pull from the abstract to the concrete to say our survival is threatened, but really your safety and security is threatened, and your body is confused by those messages sometimes.
Yeah, exactly. And it's the emotions that are causing the challenges. It's not the soma, it's not the body that are causing the challenges. One rung up is love and belongingness, and again, we stay in something that's more abstract and something that's entirely emotional generally, which is I'm maybe in fights with the people that I love, right? Like maybe my spouse and I are having a lot of fights, and I feel like I can't seem to get into harmony with the people in my life, or I'm having challenges with family members or friends, right? Like these are things around whether or not I'm going to be able to keep my connections and keep my intimacy. Or it's the loneliness of not feeling like you're part of a group. It's a feeling like maybe you've been, quote unquote, kicked out of a tribe, or you feel like you can't find your tribe. And so the loneliness is generally the biggest challenge here. And loneliness is extremely painful. Like people who are dealing with radical loneliness, or they're dealing with a lot of pain as well, but it's a pain that hits your chest, right? Like it's the heart pain of feeling like there's no place for you to land when it comes to relationships.
So you see the abstractions are getting bigger. We have the very lowest level of survival, very real to the life and death situations of our lives. Safety and security is the next rung up, where some of those abstractions, those anxieties come in. And at love and belongingness, now we have more people than ourselves involved. So there's a level of group or others, and now there's more things beyond our control. You can't control someone or force them to be in a relationship with you, whether it's friendship or romance or even family members. And so the complexities here become even greater the higher you go on the scale.
Yeah, sometimes it feels like you have less control the higher up you get. Also, you can see how a person who's maybe they're going through a divorce, how a person going through a divorce could feel like the problems that they're experiencing are just as bad as somebody who is, exposed to the elements overnight, right? Or like I've gotten to a place in my past with relationship issues, particularly with my family or with my first marriage, where I would have taken the feeling of dying by exposure other than feeling what I was feeling. So it's not that the pain is any less, but again, there's a buffer there, because dying of exposure means the game is over, right? It's done. Like there's no other problems that you ever have to experience ever again because you're dead. And so at love and belongingness, there's definitely a buffer there, and you can feel like you've got the blessing of the buffer because you can live another day to fight. And also, sometimes the pain of that is so overwhelming, you wish you were dead.
So these first three levels are called Maslow's basement.
Or at least we call them that.
Yeah. And the theory is that these are the things that most people are going to need and move through in most people's lives. So this is a very typical place that people end up going through: survival, safety and security, love and belongingness. And you want to talk about abstract, going up to the next level gets even more abstract. We're talking about self-esteem, which is setting goals for yourself or achievements for yourself and striving to reach those. And again, that's really nothing anyone else can do. That comes from within to some degree. You have to decide what you're going to do. Now there's influences, survival influences, based your physicality. Maybe you're built like a football player, so that gives you some maybe self-esteem indications, or maybe you're not built like a football player like myself, so I'm not going to go into the NFL in America. I'm going to do something different. You're wired in ways on the survival level. And then safety and security, maybe you have a socioeconomic or safety security situation that gives you opportunity for self-esteem. And then the relationships you're in or not in give you opportunities for self-esteem. But it's ultimately up to you at this level to now decide what it is that you want to be about. What is it that you are doing in the world? What is it that you're making happen? And those goals you set for yourself and work toward, that gets very abstract and very basically subjective at this point. There's not a lot of objectivity like the life and death situation at the very first level. This is very, very, very subjective.
And the pain point here is failure. It's all of the things, all the psychological and emotional burden that comes along with feeling like a failure as a human being. And that can be really bad. Like there's some real spiritual challenges that can be met here at the self-esteem level. If you keep trying for something and you keep failing over and over and over, the word is bruised. Like your ego starts to feel really bruised. You look at the stories of writers, famous and very, very successful writers, that will talk about how many rejection letters they got before they succeeded. And every time I hear that, I'm struck equally by their resilience and perseverance and how much I admire that. And then I think, Yeah, and there was a bunch of other writers that never got their break, right? Like they just kept getting those letters. They didn't get to 37 rejection letters and 38 was the golden ticket. They never got 38, right? Like they got 50 or 100, and at some point they just gave up. And I think about those people and how excruciating that must feel to be somebody who's trying to do something to gain self-esteem, to do the thing that they believe that they were put on the earth to do, and the world is just not having it. And so there is a pain here that only someone who has really tried to go out for what they want and simply not been able to do it. It's kind of hard to articulate how crushing that can be to the soul. But again, we're talking about the soul. We're not talking about the body. So there's a lot more buffer here. And I think one thing that some of the pain elements also get experienced as you go up is that you kind of hinted towards this, Joel. You weave in or sort of bake into each of these levels some of the stresses and anxieties of the earlier levels as well. So I think about college students who maybe are trying to figure out what they're going to do when they leave college. And they're at self-esteem, like the world's their oyster. They can go out and do anything they want to. And what are they going to choose? And are they going to continue to pursue whatever their major was? Or are they going to do something else because they figured out they didn't like that? And the things that they have to worry about are safety and security. Like, how are they going to make their money? Mom and dad may not be able to take care of them anymore. And maybe they've been riding on mom and dad's coattails for a while. Maybe they were able to have a free ride to college. Most college students don't at this point. They have to, they end up with an extraordinary amount of debt. But either scenario, whether or not somebody paid for you to go to college and now you have their expectations on you, and now you have love and belongingness needs crushing you, right? Or being a major node in the system of the decision you're going to make for self-esteem. Or you have this huge financial burden that you're leaving college with. And the bigger issue is safety and security. And how are you going to pay off all of that debt incurred through college? But your self-esteem challenge is also including all of the other stuff as well in it. So it's not like, while you have a buffer, it's not like those things suddenly go away when you're making these decisions. And you can see this even, lower on the ladder. Like a lot of people's, relationship fights, particularly with pair bond partners, is about finances. So the love and belongingness challenges also fold in safety and security, and at the bottom is survival. So it's like, well, how are we going to survive as a couple, right? Like, are we making enough money? And if we're not, or you're spending too much, or how come you can't get a raise at work, or whatever? The stresses of the earlier levels get brought into the current pain point of the level in which the need is going unmet. And so those just keep sort of hanging on like barnacles as you go up the levels as well.
As we move up to the final level of self-actualization, we get to the most, again, abstract element of the entire model. And self-actualization, again, my opinion is this is about radical sovereignty, about being the source point for your experience of life. It doesn't mean everything that happens to you is your fault or your responsibility, but it does mean that you're the source point. There's no, you fully realize there's no board of directors planning your life in a back room somewhere. There's no group of people helping to orchestrate things. This is on you, and you have to take sovereignty over your experience. And I think the pain point here deals around permission. Do I have the permission to be completely sovereign for my life? I've been told all my life, one might say to themselves, that I have to defer to everyone else around me. And all of a sudden, I'm realizing that I'm the only one that can make those decisions. Like, no one else knows my experience, but the pain comes to go, well, do I have permission to be this way? Am I allowed to do this? Like, who's going to stop me? Am I going to be found out that I'm just deciding these things for myself and I've decided to be basically the god of my life? And that's very destabilizing. It's a existential crisis of sorts for people. When you get here, you don't know what footing you're on because you're deciding what the footing is to begin with. It's all coming from you. And so it's a very unnerving place to be and can cause a lot of pain and stresses at that permission level.
Yeah, anybody who's gone through an existential crisis will tell you that it's an excruciating experience. And self-actualization is as close to metamorphosis as humans get. And you can go through a couple of these, by the way. It's not like you just self-actualize once. You self-actualize multiple times throughout your life, or at least one can do that if they have the circumstances to allow it. And just like in true metamorphosis with a butterfly, the caterpillar liquefies in the cocoon before it puts itself back together as a butterfly. And self-actualization can feel like going through a liquefaction process and being unsure of how to put yourself back together. And that's what the existential crisis is. That is excruciating to the soul. That is one of the most spiritually and soul-oriented pain experiences a person can go through. And oftentimes it means changing your life so radically that you got to start all over again. I think back to my dad, who chose to leave his life of, a huge salary and making really good money as an advertising executive, and then going and being a missionary, and basically going from having a very comfortable life that, was the sort of the life experience that my older siblings got to take advantage of, because he made this decision when they were graduating from high school, but I was a little kid because my brother's like almost 10 years older than me. And so he had just one kid left at home. So they figured that they probably would have an okay financial situation to be able to make those choices. And then I grew up for the rest of my life, like I said, in trailer parks, barely making ends meet. And that was okay because that was the choice he made. That was his self-actualized metamorphosis, caterpillar to butterfly decision. And it also meant that we went all the way back down, sometimes not quite survival, not quite like living on the street survival, but definitely very hard-pressed times in safety and security, very stressed out financial situations, and, relying on God to provide. And we always made it through, which is great, but that doesn't mean that the pain wasn't there. And so sometimes the pain of self-actualization is not just the process of actualizing and that liquefaction and trying to put yourself back together. Part of the challenge, like you're talking about with that sort of radical personal responsibility or sovereignty, some of that is realizing that the choices you will make will send you back to ground zero, or just about, right? Like you'll be there with more tools and resources as a person, but you still will feel like you're going backwards because you're starting all over again. And that's a very difficult decision to make.
Well, and if you've built a life up to this point at each level, you've established things at each level, relationships, career, where you live, all your systems and everything that's put there, and you begin to give yourself permission and you self-actualize to sovereignty, and people in those other systems don't like what you're doing, you could lose those systems. It could be the bottom can fall out, like out from underneath you, and now you do have to go back. Even if you didn't choose to go back and reset, you have to. It's forced upon you in some ways.
Yeah, divorce is common, actually. Like losing your love and belongingness relationships. With my parents, it was more of a safety and security thing. They stuck together, but then they were just always poor from that point on, and they never financially recovered. By the way, my parents have been quite poor from that moment on.
Well, and his self-esteem took a big hit.
His self-esteem took a hit because he had a hard time reconciling that he couldn't have both lives, right? And so the choices that he made him feel like, maybe he had failed because he couldn't both be a missionary and also somebody who had, who was able to create a certain lifestyle for his family. And also, I think that his self-esteem was buoyed up because he made a choice that he believed was spiritually right. So it's complex, right? There's like a lot to it. And I think that for a lot of people, when they go to self-actualization, they know the thing that's going to be destabilized may not be financial, but it's relationships. It's the relationships that they need to move on from and graduate from, because those relationships won't follow them there. Like my dad was fortunate that my mom was totally bought in. But there's a lot of people who realize that they should be doing something else, and the people in their lives are not willing to follow them there. And so they have to make the choice to part ways. So then again, the pain points of the earlier level follow you up the ladder. The decisions you make towards, the top of the pyramid they just have a ripple effect all the way down. But they still have more buffer. So the blessing is still there. The blessing of buffer is still there. If you're at self-actualization, you can choose not to self-actualize. You can stay in self-esteem and keep, focusing on trying to, because once you get to self-actualization, that means you did succeed at self-esteem. That's what that means. If you're going from survival to safety and security, it means you survived. It means you were successful enough at survival that you're able to now create a sustainable system of survival. If you're in love and belongingness, it means that you're not constantly and perpetually worried that you're going to be thrown back into survival. It means you've got a baseline of safety that now you can turn your attention to the warm relationships of community and loved ones. And you don't get to self-esteem if you're constantly fighting with everybody in your life or you don't feel like you have a support system. You have to have a support system to feel confident enough to work on self-esteem. And the only way you go to self-actualization is if you've proved to yourself that you can succeed, that you are the kind of person that can survive, like pushing yourself to the next level and seeing more of who you are in all of that, those sort of like those personal challenges that you've overcome. That's the only way you get to self-actualization. So you had to have met the earlier needs to go up. And also when you go up and you have pain points there, you're feeling the pain all the way down the ladder. So it's an interesting dynamic that this pyramid sort of evidences as we go through some of the challenges we experience in our lives.
We also conquer those levels, and so we tend to feel a little more comfortable there. If we're moving up Maslow, let's say a young 20-something is moving up Maslow, they're in college, maybe they've got a relationship they're in, they have a good family, they are paying the bills, they've got a job, safety and security is there, they know they're going to have the dorm room for the next 9 months in college, and the survival obviously is taken care of, and they're in that self-esteem, trying to figure out what they are going to do maybe when they get out of college at the end of the year as a senior, and they're trying to pick a career, or maybe they are out of college and all those things are handled and they're looking for the next thing in the self-esteem, and they go, you know what? I'm nervous here. The fear here is too great for me. So I'm going to drop myself back to a level that I believe I can manage and make that level my problem. So they say things like, I just can't adult today, which is language at safety and security, right? That's language around basic things like adulting, which are lower on Maslow, but it's bringing the sandbox down to something that feels more manageable. It feels like they're complaining maybe. If you see somebody on Twitter say, I just can't adult today. Well, come on, that person's an adult. Of course they know how to adult. They know how to do laundry. They know how to feed themselves, drive places, have a job, because they are adulting. But that language is them fearing the self-esteem aspects of their life and trying to use language to bring it back down to footing that feels familiar, that feels more manageable than that scary place they're going to next.
Yeah, or I think that what you just mentioned is probably exactly what's happening when people are in college and they're in self-esteem in the sense that they're not sure if they can handle it and keep their grades up. They don't know if they can deal with the workload because this might be the first time that they've been in it usually is the first time they've been in a context like this without having their parents around and structures around them to keep them accountable. And so when they go to college and now they have to keep themselves accountable and they can't do too much partying and they can't do too much staying out on the weekend, and there's going to be nobody there to ream them out if they do, and then their grades start slipping, then instead of working on bringing their grades back up and keeping in the self-esteem level, they drop out and get a job, like a quote-unquote lower level job someplace, which is another example of being at self-esteem but then bringing it on the footing that's more familiar. And you see people do that in relationship. Again, couples fight like crazy about money and safety and security. And so sometimes when there's actual relationship challenges, when there's like a lack of feeling of intimacy or connection with their spouse, they'll start fighting about money because that's the thing that they're familiar with. Or if you're at self-esteem and you feel like you're failing and you have a lot of pain points there, maybe you'll create relationship drama in your life because relationship drama is the thing that feels the most familiar to you. And so that's always sort of where the dialogue goes. So most of us have almost like a comfort zone of problems and challenges, ones that we feel is in our sandbox to solve. And when we are at higher levels and these problems feel beyond our capacity to understand, then we'll jerk the wheel and we'll send ourselves right back down to whatever level feels more manageable to us or is just the devil that we know. And I think there's value in knowing what your comfort zone is. Like, where do you keep jerking the problems to because that's more comfortable or familiar territory? I think it's good to watch yourself do that and have awareness around it. I think sometimes it's baffling to the people around us why we do that. And I think we could probably clear up some of the confusion that the people in our lives have when we do this. But I also think that being aware of it means that we don't give ourselves as much of an out. Like, we can have some of the crucial conversations that we need to have if we're not just defaulting to whatever is our problem or challenge comfort zone.
I think also the first 3 levels tend to put us on the defense. We play defense there. And the top 2 levels, we tend to play offense. So if you're wired to play offense, but you're at a lower level, you may get more aggressive or hostile at those levels because you're wired to set goals for yourself, to self-actualize these things. But if you're at higher levels and you're trying to play offense, set goals for yourself and achieve something, but you're wired for defense, you tend to slip back and play defense at lower levels for that. Does that make sense, what I'm saying? I know that's abstract.
No, I think you're right. Well, or not even, I agree with what you're saying. I think that it's not even wired to play offense or defense. I think it's probably more like what you feel you can manage in that moment. Because when you're playing defense, it's usually because you feel like you lack energy. Like, being defensive is a place of scarcity. And being assertive or playing quote unquote offense is a place of optimism and more, you feel more resourced. You have the resource to make attempts. And so I don't know if it's like a person is necessarily naturally wired, but maybe there's something in the wiring that we have based on what we're familiar with growing up or the messaging we were given, or even maybe personality type. Like, I've noticed that. So if you listen to last week's podcast about Egypt, I came back in a little bit of an existential crisis, and you can kind of hear it coming out in the podcast. Like, I talk a little bit about how we're all meaningless and specks of dust in the universe and nothing matters. And a part of it's because for whatever reason, I'm in a time period of self-actualization, and I feel like the caterpillar that's liquefied and I can't put myself back together. And it is incredibly excruciatingly painful. And for whatever reason, something about our trip to Egypt, or maybe it was just the timing was coincidental, it struck me in a way where now I'm really dealing with a lot of this stuff. Apparently it's time to self-actualize and go to the next level, but man, I am resisting it hard for some reason, and I haven't figured that out. And yet the arguments that I've been manufacturing, right? Because when you're feeling really, really, I don't know, when you're feeling in this place, no matter what the pain point is, as long as it's not survival, you're usually figuring out some sort of relief valve and picking a fight. That's my observation. Not always, but or you're hiding away from reality. You're either putting the covers over your head and hoping everybody will go away, or you're out there picking a fight, depending upon who you are. I'm a pick a fight kind of person, so I find myself trying to pull it on the love and belongingness level all the time. And I suspect that's because of multiple nodes in the system that is me. A part of it is that I still have, healing work to do around rejection from my past. I use extroverted feeling or harmony as my 10-year-old or tertiary function. And in my car model, that's my defensive position. So connectedness to other people and my relationships to others, and whether or not that's in simpatico, tends to be something that comes up for me. In the Enneagram system, I'm a sexual subtype, so intimate relationships are always something that I associate with my personal survival strategy and self-preservation. So it's, or I shouldn't say self-preservation because that's confusing, because self-preservation is also an instinct in the subtypes of the Enneagram. But I have a direct correlation in my mind with intimacy and survival. And so for me, no matter what I'm experiencing or whatever's going on for me, I'm pulling the argument into the sandbox of love and belongingness, right? Like, that's always, for some reason, that's just really familiar, comfortable territory to, kind of pretend that that's what I'm dealing with, even if I'm dealing with something as abstract and soul-crushing as self-actualization pain points.
For me, I think I pull it into safety and security often. Anxiety seems to be the underwriting emotion that I can find readily if I'm not watching for it. And it probably also has to do with my personality wiring and how I'm made up. I'm an ENFP in the Myers-Briggs system, so that 10-year-old extroverted thinking effectiveness, tertiary process is worried about resource and ensuring on a timeline that resource will be apportioned properly for myself, my family, the company, things like that. So I have a tendency, I think, to live in that space. And also probably the emotions that we have also tend to put us in different places. So for example, you tend to run toward grief and sadness, Antonia. I tend to run toward fear and anxiety. And that makes sense because I'm a social 6 in the Enneagram system. You're a sexual 3. So these are the emotions we tend to run toward that put us at these Maslow levels too, or we try to bring it onto those terms or those levels of Maslow when we're struggling at something at a different level.
And I think when you are building awareness around some of the strategies and tricks you play on yourself to bring things into your comfort zone of problems. Like, I do think that we have comfort zones of problems and challenges. We really do. There are certain things that are just beyond our ability to deal with. And anytime even the smallest problem or challenge surfaces in that, we have a tendency to run away from it and try to put it on our sandbox. And knowing your personality types in Myers-Briggs, knowing your personality type in the Enneagram, your subtype in particular, and understanding the influences of your childhood and maybe some of the grief or the traumas you still have to do some healing from, like all of that stuff, those are all nodes in the system of why whatever it is that is your broken record, that keeps coming up in your life over and over, all of that plays into it. And so I think one thing that's really valuable is charting that system out. Charting the nodes of the system of why you have a tendency to always fight about or believe everything falls in some one basket. So knowing, first of all, what your basket is, knowing what your go-to strategy of problem or challenge or the sandbox you keep trying to jerk everything toward or to. First of all, knowing what that is and having awareness around it. And then going back and reverse engineering all of the things that influence why that's the case. And so then when you find yourself doing that, when I'm in the middle of an existential crisis and I feel like a liquefied butterfly that can't put myself back together, and then I watch myself say it's because nobody loves me and everybody rejected me throughout my life, and going, is that really what's going on? Is that really the problem? Or is it that I'm terrified to face what's actually happening for me, which is that I need to up my game in understanding what I'm, like these self-actualization principles. What is it that I'm supposed to be graduating to that's terrifying the shit out of me, and I just won't face it. I won't face that level of maybe radical, self-understanding or radical, honesty with myself. I'm avoiding it, and so then I'm rushing to my 10-year-old or tertiary function of extroverted feeling or harmony and going, it must be a love and belongingness issue. And I think just knowing that I think is really helpful for figuring out what's keeping you stuck at the place that you can't seem to get past that glass ceiling.
So awareness is what you're suggesting, and I think that's a great piece of advice. I also think that awareness is easier found when things don't go well. So when the stresses come, the tension points come. I know in my life, I have a tendency to, let's say I have a fight with somebody or something goes awry, I don't really want to look at it because it's something that felt icky and gross and I don't like that aspect of myself. And yet some of the best understanding can be to reflect on those moments, reflect on that anxiety I had maybe at safety and security and go, okay, why did I just have that anxious outburst? Why was I whining and complaining about this thing? What is going on there for me? And that reflection time period for you listening, I think can be very valuable in your life. If you can sit down and say, what was going on for me? And start to increase the levels of self-awareness after the fact of something happening, that can start to point you. It's like a signpost or maybe even a marker on a map to what's going on for you in your life. Where are you in this space, and where are you trying to bring things onto different sandboxes than where they're supposed to be? So I think that's something that you can just kind of keep aware and in mind, and that's going to take some work maybe on your part. some self-reflection, some honesty with yourself about what's actually going on. And I think the thing that we all avoid is we feel like if we get an accurate representation of self-awareness, what's going on for us, that's going to automatically equal behaviors or outcomes that maybe we don't agree with. And I would say start to separate that in your mind as well. I don't think just being self-aware of why you do something necessarily means you have to change behavior of that thing. Just knowing what drives you, what motivates you, why you do what you do, and where you are accurately is valuable in and of itself, even if you choose to continue doing that. That's okay within reason. I mean, you got to make up the choice for yourself, but I don't think that just being aware means that you're now at a deficit or you're beholden to something outside yourself.
Well, it doesn't mean you're a bad person, right? Like anytime we're feeding into the problems that we're experiencing in life. And by the way, that's in order to do the work we're talking about, in order to do the work you're talking about, Joel, you have to understand that you're a node in every system. Like whatever the emergent is, the emergent that you don't like, the challenge, the problem, the thing that is happening that you're not a fan of in your world, you are a node in that system. And so you must understand how you're feeding into that system, right? Otherwise, it wouldn't be happening to you if you're not a node. So the first thing you have to do is recognize that you have responsibility here somewhere, in some capacity. On a scale of 1 to 100, it might be very low. You might have 2% influence in it, but there's still some influence that you're bringing as a node to that system. So just recognizing that a little self-awareness around all of this can go a long way. And I think the thing you're saying, Joel, is what people at the beginning levels of this need to hear, right? And it is true and it's not true at the same time. It's true in the sense of if everybody believes that self-awareness means that they have to radically alter their identity and be, almost a stranger to themselves eventually. Like if everybody knew exactly what goes into personal development and growth, literally nobody would start because you're not ready for behavior change at the moment of deciding to implement a little self-awareness in your life. You're not ready for that behavior change. So the reason why what you're saying is right is self-awareness at the very beginning phases is enough. It's enough at that phase until you get to a place of being resourced enough in your self-awareness to now consider the changes that need to be made. So you're accurate, I would say, Joel, in the sense that just having some self-awareness does not mean you have to change your behavior, who you are. But I would say that the next lily pad in that path, right? The thing that you're skipping to next is eventually you're not going to want to stay the same because that self-awareness will make you cringe. You'll get to a place where once you acknowledge your influence in these systems, whether it's 2% or 98%, when you start to realize how you're infecting this system that's creating the challenges and problems or the situations or circumstances you don't like, there will be a moment when you're feeling motivated. You'll have the energy that comes from personal motivation, right? Something that's generative within oneself to then make the changes that you need to make. And that's something that happens a little later. So it's good to remind people that self-awareness, like we recommend self-awareness and don't be intimidated by it. It's a good thing. And also don't feel like realizing maybe the tricks and strategies you're playing on yourself, that doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you a person. Like that's human. All of us do it. And some self-awareness is like the first step to eventually making the changes that will allow you to have a much better emergent from the system of your life.
So you've been listening with us. You haven't had a microphone, but it's your turn to come over and make your voice heard. What's coming up for you in this discussion? Where are you in your life in general on Maslow's hierarchy of needs? Where do you place yourself? Have you slipped back at times in your life? Have you had a story where you've peaked and then you've dropped? Have you brought things onto your sandbox or a sandbox that feels more comfortable to you when you get to levels that are more challenging? Share your story with us. Let us know what's going on for you. Come over to personalityhacker.com. Directly below this podcast, you can ask a question, leave a comment, or share your personal experience, which is really powerful for us to read about you and the community here at Personality Hacker to start reading about each other's experiences. This is a great format for us to grow together as people.
And if you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. There's a lot of stuff for me to pitch here, so I'm just going to tally it off. The first one is leave us a rating and review on iTunes. That is incredibly helpful to us, and I read every one. Number 2, you can leave us a rating and review for our book, which is also called Personality Hacker. You can find it on Amazon, Books A Million, a lot of online retailers. And if you leave us a rating and review for that, that's also quite helpful. And the third thing I want to talk about is that it has come to my attention recently that there are podcast listeners that don't know that we have programs available, premium content programs on our website that are uber cool because we put them together and we're awesome people, right? I mean, you listen to us because you think we're cool, right? So the way that we finance the podcast is not through advertising. If you notice that we never advertise and never have in the 6 years we've been doing this, but the way that we finance the podcast is through our website and people purchasing programs from us. So if that's something that's interesting to you and you want to go invest in yourself and your personal growth, doing it through the lens of personality types and different models like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I highly recommend you go to personalityhacker.com and look for the catalog of our programs and see if there's one that's right for you.
My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.